Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that everything you've ever believed about humanity was never meant to be true. That our wars, our dreams, our love, even our intelligence were not the natural rise of an evolving species, but the unfinished results of an abandoned experiment. An experiment conducted by something that watched us grow, judged us, and then walked away. And what if the most unsettling part isn't that they left, but that we might be the reason they did? Because if humanity was an alien experiment that failed, then every moment of our history is not just survival, it's evidence. And once you begin to look at our past through that lens, you start to notice things you can't unsee. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you may start to question not just where we came from, but whether we were ever meant to succeed at all. Before we go deeper, take 1 second to support the journey. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and what you do in your daily life. It's fascinating to see the real human world behind the screen, especially in a story like this. Now, let's begin. Long before history had a language, before ink touched clay, before names were carved into stone, there were eyes looking upward. Not in worship, in recognition. Imagine the earliest humans standing under a sky so dark and clear it felt almost alive. No city lights, no noise, only a vast ceiling of stars stretching infinitely above them. To us, it is beautiful. To them, it was something else. It was presence. Across continents that had never met, among tribes that would never share a word, the same gesture appeared again and again, fingers pointing upward, stories told of beings who came down from the sky, who shaped the earth, who altered life, who left. And then, silence. It begins in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, where one of the earliest recorded civilizations left behind tablets pressed with cuneiform symbols. In those ancient lines are stories of the Anunnaki, figures described not merely as gods, but as beings who descended from the heavens to create and manage humanity. They were said to have engineered humans to serve, to build, to sustain their needs. And then, in many versions of the tale, they departed, leaving humanity to govern itself. But this wasn't an isolated story. Thousands of miles away, along the Nile, ancient Egyptians spoke of the Ennead, deities who emerged from the sky, bringing order to chaos, shaping the first humans, and establishing kingship as a divine extension of their authority. Pharaohs were not merely rulers, they were intermediaries, links between humanity and those who had once come from above. Further east, in the Vedic traditions of ancient India, the texts describe the Devas, celestial beings who possessed advanced knowledge, wielded weapons of light, and traveled in airborne crafts known as vimanas. They intervened in human affairs, guided knowledge, and then receded into the heavens. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, the Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity, descended from the sky, taught humans agriculture, astronomy, and law, and promised one day to return. Different continents, different languages, no contact, yet the same story. Beings from the sky, creation, guidance, departure. It's easy to call these myths, metaphors born from fear and imagination, but there's a detail that refuses to stay quiet: the consistency of the narrative across cultures that had no possible way to share it. Why would isolated civilizations invent the same origin story? Why would early humans across the world independently imagine that they were created by visitors from the sky? Unless they weren't imagining. Unless they were remembering. Because the human brain does something remarkable when confronted with something it cannot explain. It translates the unknown into the familiar, Advanced technology becomes divine power. Visitors in machines become gods in chariots. Structured experiments become creation myths. And over generations, memory softens into story. But sometimes fragments survive. In caves scattered across Europe, Australia, and Africa, ancient paintings depict strange figures, humanoid shapes with elongated heads, large black eyes, and what appear to be helmets or suits. These figures are not animals. They are not stylized humans. They are different. In the cave art of Val Camonica in Italy, figures appear wearing what look like glowing helmets. In the Wandjina rock art of Australia, beings with halo-like heads and no mouths stare outward with oversized eyes. In Tassili Najir in the Sahara, paintings show what many describe as round-headed beings with floating forms. Archaeologists interpret these images as ritualistic or symbolic. But what if they are observational? What if early humans were documenting what they saw the only way they could, with pigment and stone? The idea begins to take shape slowly, like a shadow revealing itself at the edge of perception. If something visited early humanity, observed, interacted, even influenced, then the sky was not just a backdrop to our existence, it was a workspace, a laboratory. But every experiment has a purpose, and every experiment has a timeline. If humanity was being observed or influenced, what were the observers looking for? Intelligence? Cooperation? Adaptability? Or something far more specific, something we haven't yet recognized within ourselves? Because if the stories are echoes of a real encounter, then there must have been a beginning, a moment when the observers first arrived. And perhaps, if we look carefully, there are clues hidden in the transition between early human evolution and sudden cultural awakening. For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens existed as hunter-gatherers with relatively simple tools and social structures. Then, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. Rapidly, almost abruptly. Agriculture emerged, permanent settlements appeared, written language developed, astronomy, mathematics, architecture all blossomed within a remarkably short span of time. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside the human mind, a sudden acceleration, a spark. Mainstream history explains this as a natural progression. Climate change after the last ice age created conditions suitable for farming, leading to social complexity, which led to civilization. But there's a quiet question beneath that explanation. Why did it happen so fast? Evolution, both biological and cultural, tends to be gradual, incremental, but the rise of civilization feels compressed, as though knowledge was not slowly discovered, but rapidly accessed, taught, introduced, or unlocked. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed a full writing system seemingly out of nowhere. In Egypt, the pyramids appeared with architectural precision that still challenges modern engineers. In the Indus Valley, cities were built with advanced drainage systems and urban planning. Each civilization seemed to awaken with knowledge already in place, like students arriving in a classroom with instructions they did not write. And then there are the stars. Every early civilization developed detailed astronomical knowledge, tracking planetary motion, mapping constellations, predicting eclipses. The Mayans calculated the solar year with remarkable accuracy. The Egyptians aligned pyramids with Orion's belt. Ancient Indian texts described planetary positions with precision. Why did early humans look to the sky with such urgency? Because that is where the gods lived, or perhaps where the observers came from. The sky was not just a source of wonder, it was a reference point, a place of origin, a place of return. If humanity was part of an experiment, then early civilization might be phase 1, an introduction of knowledge, a stimulation of growth, a test of potential. And like all experiments, there would be observation, evaluation, measurement. which means there may have been a moment when the observers stopped guiding and began simply watching, to see what we would do next, to see whether we would grow into what they intended or drift into something else entirely. And if that moment existed, if there was a point when guidance ended and observation began, then somewhere in our ancient past there should be a shift, a subtle tone of our stories, from beings who walked among us to beings who watched from afar, from presence to absence. Because every experiment has a phase when the scientist steps back from the subject, and the subject is left alone, to succeed or to fail. And once that moment comes, the sky no longer feels like a place of gods. It feels like something else entirely. A ceiling, a window, or maybe a one-way mirror. And somewhere beyond it, something may still be watching, quietly, waiting, recording, deciding whether the experiment continues or ends. If the sky was ever a laboratory, then the most important work was never done above us. It was done within us. Inside every human body, in every drop of blood, in every cell that silently divides and repairs itself, there exists a structure so intricate that even today, with all of our technology, we can only read it. We can't fully comprehend it. DNA. 3 billion base pairs arranged in precise sequences, forming a biological language more complex than any spoken tongue, more structured than any software ever written. It determines how we grow, how we heal, how we think, how we feel. It carries memories of ancestors we will never meet. It holds instructions that activate and deactivate throughout our lives, like lines of code executed on a schedule. But there is something unsettling about it, because the more we learn to read this code, the more it begins to feel written. Scientists have often described DNA using the language of engineering. They call sections instructions, edits, replication protocols, error correction systems. Genes are switched on and off by regulatory sequences like toggles. Cells follow timed cycles like programs executing loops. This is not poetry. It is literal scientific terminology. And for decades, one of the strangest mysteries within that code was something researchers casually labeled as junk DNA. Vast portions of the human genome that did not appear to produce proteins or serve an obvious biological purpose. At one point, scientists estimated that over 90% of our DNA was functionless, unused, silent, which raised a question that few people outside of genetics ever heard. Why would evolution, a process defined by efficiency and survival, preserve such an enormous amount of unused code? Nature does not tend to waste space without reason, so what is all that extra information doing there? In recent years, research has begun to reveal that this so-called junk DNA may not be junk at all. It plays roles in regulation, timing, structure, and long-term genetic memory. Some sections act like switches, others act like archives. Some appear to activate only under specific environmental conditions, dormant, waiting, as if parts of the human genome are not designed for constant use, but for conditional activation, like features of a system that haven't yet been unlocked. And once you begin to look at DNA as a kind of code, something that can be written, edited, and modified, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who wrote it? Mainstream science explains DNA as the result of billions of years of natural selection, mutations tested against the environment, with successful traits passed on and unsuccessful ones removed. It is a powerful, evidence-based explanation. But there are moments within human genetics that don't fit cleanly into the slow, incremental pace that evolution usually follows. Moments where change appears sudden, compressed, unusually efficient. One of the most discussed examples is the fusion of human chromosome 2, Unlike other primates, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes instead of 24. When scientists examined human chromosome 2, they discovered something astonishing. It appears to be the result of two ancestral chromosomes fused end to end. The fusion is precise, clean, stable, as if two separate strands were deliberately joined. Evolution can produce such events, yes. Chromosomal fusions do occur naturally, but the result in humans is unusually orderly, without the kind of chaotic instability that often accompanies such drastic changes. And this fusion is not a minor detail. It is part of what separates humans genetically from our closest relatives, a small change with enormous consequences. Then there is the rapid expansion of the human brain. For millions of years, our ancestors' brain sizes grew gradually. Then, in a relatively short evolutionary window, the human brain expanded dramatically, especially in areas associated with language, abstract thinking, and complex planning. It was as if something accelerated the process, as if the code had been updated. And then there is language itself. The ability to take thoughts, abstract, emotional, conceptual, and convert them into structured symbols and sounds. Language is not just communication, it is compression of reality into patterns that can be shared, stored, and transmitted across generations. No other species on Earth uses language in the same recursive, symbolic way humans do. Where did that ability come from? Was it an emergent property of brain complexity? Or was it an intended feature? Because if you were designing a species capable of being observed, studied, or even guided, language would be essential. It would allow the subjects to record their own history, to describe their own behavior, to unknowingly generate data. The idea is unsettling, but it leads to another question that feels even more uncomfortable. If DNA is code, and code can be edited, is it possible that humanity has been edited? Not necessarily in the sense of a single dramatic intervention, but perhaps in subtle adjustments, small modifications across generations, tiny shifts that nudged humanity towards certain capabilities, intelligence, creativity, aggression, empathy, all traits that shape not just survival, but behavior. And behavior is what any observer would be most interested in measuring. But if this were true, if humanity's genetic code had been influenced, then we might expect to see something else within us. Flaws, unexpected side effects. Because no experiment is perfect, and no code is without bugs. Humans are capable of extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty. We can create music that moves millions, and weapons that can end millions. We cooperate to build civilizations, and divide ourselves into conflicts that last generations. This duality is not subtle, it is extreme. Almost as if the human system contains competing directives, one that pushes toward connection, another that pushes toward dominance. And these two drives often collide, creating the instability that defines so much of human history. If humanity were purely the product of natural evolution, such contradictions might simply be the byproduct of survival pressures. But if humanity were part of an experiment, if we were designed or modified to test certain outcomes, then those contradictions might not be accidents. They might be variables. Traits introduced intentionally to see how a species handles internal conflict, how it resolves tension between cooperation and competition, between empathy and aggression, between self-preservation and collective good. And if that is the case, then every human life is part of that dataset. Every decision, every moral choice, every act of kindness or harm, all of it contributing to a larger pattern, a pattern that could be measured, evaluated, judged. But there is one more detail hidden inside our biology that deepens the mystery. The human body is not optimized for survival in the way many other species are. We have fragile spines that cause back pain. Our birth process is dangerously difficult compared to other mammals. We are vulnerable to a wide range of diseases. Our teeth decay easily. Our vision weakens with age. We are intelligent, but physically inefficient, almost as if we were not designed for long-term survival in a harsh natural environment. Almost as if our primary function was not physical dominance, but something else, something cognitive, observational, reflective. A species designed less for enduring nature and more for interpreting it, recording it, questioning it. Which leads to a final quiet thought that lingers beneath all the science and speculation. If the code inside our cells contains instructions we do not yet fully understand, if parts of our genome remain dormant, waiting for conditions we have not yet reached, if our intelligence appeared suddenly and our behavior contains built-in contradictions, then perhaps humanity is not a finished product. Perhaps we are not a completed design. Perhaps we are still in development, a system mid-process, a code base still being tested. And if that's true, then somewhere, at some point in our past, there must have been a moment when the results of that test began to show, when the behaviors encoded within us started to shape civilizations, to build structures, to form hierarchies, to create order and disorder. Because code does not exist in isolation, it expresses itself through action. And once the code of humanity began to express itself on a global scale, the outcome of the experiment would become visible, observable, measurable. Which means that the next phase of this story does not lie in our cells, it lies in our history, in the rise of the first great civilizations, and in the patterns they all seemed to share. Because if humanity was an experiment, then the first real test was not whether we could exist, it was whether we could remain stable. And history suggests that stability may have been the first sign that something had already gone wrong. The code inside us did not remain hidden for long. It surfaced the moment humans began living together, not just in small tribes or scattered groups, but in cities, in organized societies, in places where thousands of minds shared space, resources, power, and belief. That was where the real test began. Because it is one thing for a species to survive in isolation, it is another thing entirely for it to remain stable when it must coexist. The earliest cities rose like sparks across the ancient world, in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, along the winding banks of the Indus Valley, and beside the life-giving waters of the Nile River, humanity did something unprecedented. We gathered, we organized, we built. We created laws, rituals, markets, hierarchies. We assigned roles, distributed labor, and developed systems that allowed thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of individuals to function as a single organism. From a distance, it was extraordinary. Cities rose with planned streets, drainage systems, storage facilities, temples, and administrative centers. In Sumer, the city of stood as a beacon of urban life. In the Indus Valley civilization, cities like Mohenjo-Daro displayed remarkable sanitation and planning. In ancient Egypt, monumental architecture reached toward the sky with precision and intent. It was as if humanity had learned how to scale itself, to become something larger than the individual. From the perspective of an observer, if one existed, this would have been a critical milestone. The subjects had reached social complexity. They could cooperate beyond kinship. They could build structures, share knowledge, and create culture. The experiment was progressing. But then something else emerged: conflict. At first it was subtle, small disputes over land, resources, water access. But as populations grew and systems became more complex, conflict began to scale with them. What began as disagreement evolved into organized violence. The earliest written records already speak of war. In Sumerian tablets, kings boast of conquering neighboring cities. In Egyptian inscriptions, pharaohs celebrate campaigns of domination. Across ancient China and the Levant, evidence of fortified walls, weapons, and battle scars tells the same story. Humanity had learned to build, and then, almost immediately, we learned to destroy. It is a pattern that repeats with unsettling precision.
civilization rises, it stabilizes, it flourishes, and then, often from within, it fractures. The Indus Valley civilization, once a vast and orderly network of cities, declines mysteriously. There is no single catastrophic invasion recorded, only signs of gradual breakdown, abandonment, and dispersal. The great cities of Sumer rise and fall in cycles, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, each dominating for a time before being overtaken or collapsing under internal strain. In ancient Egypt, long periods of stability known as the Old and Middle Kingdoms are punctuated by intermediate periods, times of fragmentation, famine, and political chaos. The pattern is so consistent it begins to feel systemic, like a stress test. Build a society, increase its complexity, introduce variables, scarcity, ambition, inequality. Observe how it responds. Does it maintain cohesion, or does it fracture under pressure? If humanity was being observed, these early civilizations would have provided rich data, because they revealed something fundamental about human behavior. We are capable of extraordinary cooperation, but we are equally capable of extraordinary division, and the two forces often emerge from the same source. Take hierarchy. Hierarchy allows for organization, efficiency, leadership. It enables large groups to function with direction and purpose. But hierarchy also creates inequality, differences in power, in access, in control.
Those differences generate tension, and tension, if not managed, becomes conflict. The code inside us seems to carry both impulses at once, the drive to unite and the drive to dominate. And when those two impulses collide inside a growing civilization, instability follows. There are moments in early history that feel almost like warning signals, moments where a society reaches a peak of advancement and then suddenly collapses, as if something in the system failed. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is one such moment. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, major civilizations, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and others, fall within a relatively short period. Cities are abandoned, trade networks disappear, writing systems are lost. For centuries, historians have debated the cause: earthquakes, drought, invasions, internal rebellion. But the striking thing is not just that collapse occurred, it is how widespread it was. Multiple advanced societies in different regions, all failing within the same window of time, as if the system reached a tipping point, as if the variables exceeded the stability threshold. And then there are the Mayans in Mesoamerica, whose cities flourished with advanced astronomy, architecture, and mathematics, only to be gradually abandoned. The reasons remain debated: climate stress, warfare, overpopulation. But again, the pattern is familiar: complexity, pressure, instability, collapse. If you were observing humanity as an experiment, these cycles would be critical data points. They would show not just what humans can achieve, but how they respond when their own systems become strained. Do they adapt? Do they cooperate? Or do they fragment? And history suggests that more often than not, we fragment. But there is something even more curious about these collapses. They are often preceded by signs, subtle changes in climate, in resource distribution, in political structure, early warnings that, if addressed collectively, might have prevented the worst outcomes. Yet time and again, those warnings are ignored or mismanaged. It is as if the human system struggles to respond to long-term threats when short-term interests are at stake, a kind of cognitive limitation, or perhaps a feature of the design. Because a species that can think abstractly, plan for the future, and cooperate at scale should, in theory, be capable of avoiding self-destruction. And yet, we repeatedly approach the edge, as though something within us resists equilibrium, as though the code carries not just the potential for greatness, but a built-in instability. And if that instability was not accidental, if it was part of the experiment, then the question becomes even more unsettling. What were the observers hoping to learn?
Perhaps they wanted to see whether a species with competing drives could find balance, whether intelligence could overcome aggression, whether empathy could outpace dominance, whether self-awareness could lead to self-correction. Early civilizations were the first large-scale trials of those questions, and the results were mixed. Humanity proved it could build. It proved it could create art, law, science, and culture. But it also proved it could destroy those same creations, sometimes within a single generation. If someone was watching, they would have seen both outcomes, the promise and the flaw. And as the centuries passed, as empires rose and fell, as wars became more organized and more devastating, the data would have become clearer. The pattern would have become undeniable. Because instability did not disappear with early civilizations, it evolved, scaled, intensified, until it reached a point where the consequences of human conflict were no longer local or regional, but global. But before that moment, before humanity reached the ability to affect the entire planet, there is another thread running through history. A quieter one, less obvious, but deeply unsettling. Throughout these cycles of rise and collapse, of progress and destruction, there are persistent reports of something else, something above. Objects in the sky during moments of great change, strange lights, unexplained phenomena, recorded by people who had no language for technology, but knew what they saw was not ordinary. If humanity was being observed, then perhaps the observers did not leave completely. Perhaps they watched, from a distance, from above, silent, because every experiment, once it reaches a certain stage, enters a phase of observation without intervention. And if that phase existed in our past, then the next clues might not be found in our cities or our ruins, but in the sky above them, watching, waiting, recording the outcome. As humanity moved closer and closer to either stabilizing itself or proving for once and for all that the experiment had begun to fail.
By the time humanity learned to build empires, the sky had already become something more than a ceiling. It had become a question. Across continents and centuries, people began recording things they did not understand. Objects that moved against the stars, lights that hovered without fire, shapes that drifted silently above battlefields and cities. They were not common, they were not constant, but they appeared often enough, and in moments significant enough, that they left marks in our records. Marks that feel less like myth and more like observation. In the Roman world, historians preserved accounts of strange aerial phenomena. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder described objects that moved like shields in the sky, reflecting sunlight as they glided over the horizon. Later, the historian Livy recorded reports of phantom ships seen in the air above cities, visions that witnesses described with consistency even if they lacked the language to explain them. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, chroniclers wrote of fiery disks and burning wheels appearing in the sky, especially during times of war or political upheaval. In 1561, residents of Nuremberg described a mass sighting of objects, spheres, crosses, and cylindrical shapes that seemed to engage in a kind of aerial display at dawn. Woodcut prints were made to document what witnesses claimed to see. Historians often interpret these events as atmospheric phenomena, sundogs, halos, meteor showers, optical illusions, and in many cases those explanations are likely correct. But not in all. Because what's striking is not just that people saw things in the sky, it's when they saw them. Moments of transition, moments of crisis, moments when the trajectory of human history was shifting. The pattern appears again and again, like a faint signal repeating across time. In ancient China, records from imperial astronomers described Gesk stars and moving lights that did not behave like known celestial bodies.
These observers were meticulous, trained to track the sky with precision. When something did not fit known patterns, it was noted. In Japan, during the 12th century, texts described lights in the night sky that danced and maneuvered. Samurai leaders debated whether they were omens or natural phenomena. In Europe, during the Renaissance, paintings such as the Madonna with Saint Giovannino depict small, disc-like objects in the sky, objects that modern viewers often notice immediately, but which at the time were simply integrated into religious imagery. These were not modern people projecting spacecraft onto clouds. These were pre-industrial observers describing something they did not have words for. And they often described it in similar ways: disks, spheres, objects that hovered, objects that moved against the wind, objects that appeared to observe. It is easy to dismiss these as coincidence or misinterpretation. The human mind is excellent at seeing patterns where none exist, but the frequency, the consistency, and the timing of these reports create a quiet tension in the narrative. Because if humanity was being observed, if we were part of some long-term study, then observation would not be constant. It would be periodic, targeted, focused on moments of change, and that is exactly when these sightings seem to cluster. During wars, during the rise and fall of empires, during technological breakthroughs, during moments when human behavior shifts in ways that could alter the trajectory of the species. From the perspective of an observer, those are the moments that matter, the data points, the turning points. And as human history moved forward, these reports did not disappear, they evolved. With the invention of telescopes, people began seeing objects at higher altitudes, points of light that changed direction, accelerated unexpectedly, or appeared where no known star or planet should be. In the 19th century, during the early age of flight, newspapers in the United States reported airships seen moving silently across the night sky, long before powered aircraft were widely developed. And then, in the 20th century, as humanity entered the age of aviation and radar, the sightings became measurable. Pilots reported objects that outpaced their planes. Radar operators tracked targets that moved with no identifiable propulsion. Military personnel documented encounters with objects that performed maneuvers beyond known human technology.
These reports, often declassified decades later, are no longer just folklore. They are data. Incomplete, debated, often inconclusive, but persistent. And they raise a question that sits quietly at the edge of our understanding. If something has been watching humanity, what has it been looking for? Behavior, adaptation, decision-making under pressure, conflict resolution, technological progression. These are the variables that define whether a species can survive long-term, whether it can expand beyond its homeworld, whether it can manage its own power without destroying itself. If humanity was part of an experiment, then the moment we began to develop advanced technology, flight, radio communication, nuclear energy, would have been a critical phase. Because those developments change everything. They increase our reach, our power, our ability to affect not just our own species, but the planet itself, and perhaps beyond. From that perspective, the 20th century would not just be another chapter in human history. It would be a checkpoint, a moment when the observers would pay close attention. And that is exactly when sightings increase. During World War II, pilots on both sides reported Foo Fighters, glowing orbs that followed aircraft, maneuvered intelligently, and then vanished. Neither side could explain them, and both assumed they might be secret enemy technology. They were not. Decades later, in the Cold War era, as nuclear weapons were developed and tested, there are documented reports of unidentified objects appearing near missile bases, objects that seem to interfere with systems, disable controls, or simply observe. These accounts remain controversial,
debated and often classified, but they exist, and whether one interprets them as advanced human technology, natural phenomena, or something else entirely, they contribute to a pattern that stretches back through history, a pattern of something in the sky, present during moments when humanity approaches a threshold. But there is another possibility, one that feels even more unsettling. What if the watchers were not just observing, but evaluating? Every experiment has criteria, conditions that define success or failure, metrics that determine whether the subject has achieved the intended outcome. If humanity was designed or modified to test certain traits, then those traits would need to be measured over time, and observation would be the method. Silent, non-interfering, recording what happens when humans are left to make their own choices, when we choose cooperation or conflict, creation or destruction, unity or division. The sky, in that sense, becomes not just a place of observation, but a one-way mirror. We look up and see stars. If something is there, it looks down and sees us. And at some point, if this framework is even partially true, there would come a moment when the data is sufficient, when enough observation has taken place to reach a conclusion, a judgment, a determination of whether the experiment is proceeding as intended or deviating beyond acceptable limits. And history suggests that there was a time when human behavior changed in a way that could not be ignored, a moment when our capacity for destruction reached a scale that had never existed before, a moment when, for the first time, humanity gained the ability to end not just cities or empires, but itself. Because when that threshold is crossed, the question is no longer whether a species can build or survive. The question becomes whether it can be trusted with its own power. And if there were watchers in the sky, that would be the moment they would be watching most closely, because that is the moment when an experiment either proves its success or reveals its failure.
There is rarely a single instant when a long story changes direction. No clear sound, no visible fracture, just a slow accumulation of pressure until something gives. Human history is filled with moments of violence and conflict, but for thousands of years, those events were limited in scale. Armies clashed, cities fell, empires rose and collapsed, but the damage, as devastating as it was, remained local, contained within regions, within borders, within the reach of human bodies and basic weapons. The experiment, if it was one, could continue. The subjects were destructive, yes, but not yet capable of ending themselves. That changed in the 20th century. It did not happen all at once. It began with ideas, new ways of understanding matter, energy, and the structure of the universe. Scientific breakthroughs that revealed how the smallest particles of existence could be manipulated, split, and transformed into unimaginable power. Physics opened a door, and humanity walked through it. During the early 1900s, scientists across Europe and America began to uncover the secrets of the atom. They discovered that inside every atom lay a nucleus, and that within that nucleus was a force so immense that if released, it could produce energy beyond anything humanity had ever harnessed. For a time, it was pure curiosity, a quest for knowledge. But history has a way of bending knowledge toward power. As global tensions rose and war spread across continents, those scientific discoveries were no longer abstract. They became tools, resources, opportunities. The race began. In the United States, under a secret program known as the Manhattan Project, thousands of scientists worked to turn atomic theory into a weapon. Among them was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist who would later become one of the most conflicted figures in scientific history. They knew what they were building. They understood the scale of the force they were about to release, but they also feared what would happen if their enemies reached it first. So they continued. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, humanity performed an experiment of its own, the first detonation of a nuclear device, the Trinity test. In that moment, for the first time in Earth's history, a species deliberately unleashed the energy locked inside the atom. The explosion lit up the desert like a second sun, a blinding flash, a rising column of fire and dust, a shockwave that rippled through the ground and air. Witnesses described it as both beautiful and terrifying, a moment of triumph, a moment of dread. As Oppenheimer himself later recalled, a line from ancient scripture echoed in his mind, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was not just a weapon, it was a threshold. Less than a month later, that threshold was crossed again, this time not in a test, but in war. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was destroyed by a single atomic bomb. 3 days later, the same fate struck Nagasaki. In seconds, tens of thousands of lives were lost. In the days and weeks that followed, many more would die from injuries and radiation. For the first time in history, a single human-made device had the power to erase an entire city. And the world saw it, heard about it, felt the shift. Because something fundamental had changed. Until that moment, human conflict had always been limited by physical constraints, the number of soldiers, the reach of weapons, the endurance of armies. Now, for the first time, humanity possessed the ability to destroy itself at scale, not gradually, not over centuries, but in moments. This was not just another war. This was a transformation in what it meant to be human. A species that could create art, music, and philosophy now possessed the ability to end its own existence with the push of a button. If there were observers, if there were watchers measuring the outcome of this long experiment, this would have been the moment that mattered most. The moment that intelligence and power intersected at a level that required restraint, judgment, wisdom. The moment when the core question of the experiment might finally be answered. Can a species that has mastered its environment master itself? The decades that followed did not provide a simple answer. Instead, they introduced a new kind of tension, one that stretched across the entire planet, the Cold War. Two superpowers, armed with nuclear arsenals, locked in a standoff that lasted for generations. Thousands of warheads, each capable of destroying a city or built, stockpiled, and pointed at potential targets. The concept of mutually assured destruction emerged, the idea that any full-scale nuclear war would result in the annihilation of both sides and likely much of the world. It was a paradox. Peace maintained by the threat of total destruction, stability built on the edge of collapse. Humanity had created a system where survival depended on never using the most powerful tools it had ever built. It required constant vigilance, constant restraint, and constant fear. There were moments when that restraint almost failed. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. For days, decisions made by a handful of individuals could have determined the fate of millions. At multiple points in history, false alarms, miscommunications, and technical errors nearly triggered launches that would have been impossible to undo. Each time, something intervened: human judgment, hesitation, doubt, small decisions that prevented irreversible consequences. But the fact that those moments existed at all is significant. It shows how close the system has come to failure, how thin the margin can be between survival and catastrophe. If this was an experiment, then the data from this period would be complex. On one hand, humanity demonstrated extraordinary capability, scientific advancement, global communication, medical breakthroughs, the exploration of space. On the other hand, we built weapons that could erase everything we had created. We learned how to split the atom, but not how to eliminate the instinct for conflict.
We expanded our knowledge, but struggled to expand our empathy at the same pace. The imbalance is clear. Intelligence increased faster than wisdom. Power increased faster than restraint. And that imbalance is precisely what makes a system unstable. From the perspective of an observer, this would be a critical phase, a point where the trajectory could still change, where the species might learn to manage its own capabilities, or where it might continue to escalate, increasing the risk until failure becomes inevitable. Because the development of nuclear weapons was not the end of human technological growth, it was only the beginning of a new era, an era where our tools would become more powerful, more interconnected, and more capable of affecting the entire planet. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, climate engineering. Each new capability adds another layer of complexity and another opportunity for both creation and destruction. The experiment, if it exists, has not ended, but there may have been a moment when its outcome began to tilt just enough to raise concern, to trigger closer observation, to prompt a question from whatever intelligence might be watching. Have the subjects reached a point where they can no longer safely manage their own power? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then the experiment has reached its most dangerous phase. And in that phase, there are only a few possible outcomes: intervention, abandonment, or observation until the end. History suggests that no clear intervention has occurred. No undeniable external force has stepped in to stop human conflict, to remove weapons, to guide our decisions. If anything, we appear to have been left alone, which raises the possibility that at some point after humanity crossed the nuclear threshold, the observers made a decision to step back, to stop influencing, to simply watch. And if that is true, then the most unsettling part of the story is not that the experiment might have broken, it's that it might still be running, with no one stepping in to correct it, no one preventing the next mistake, no one stopping the next escalation, only recording, only waiting, only watching to see whether a species that has come this far can find a way to stabilize itself before it reaches the point of no return. Because if we cannot, then the moment the experiment broke may not be a single event in the past. It may be a line we are still crossing, slowly, quietly, one decision at a time.
If humanity had reached a dangerous threshold, if we had acquired the power to destroy ourselves and destabilize the planet that sustains us, then the silence that followed is perhaps the strangest part of the story. Because if an experiment begins to fail, a scientist usually intervenes. They adjust variables, they correct errors, they step in before the system collapses. But in the case of humanity, there has been no unmistakable correction, no visible hand removing weapons, no external force halting wars, no clear guidance delivered in a language we can verify and follow. Only absence. And that absence raises a question that feels heavier than any theory about watchers in the sky. Why would an observer allow the experiment to continue if the risk of total failure has become real? There are only a few possibilities. The first is that intervention is not allowed. If the purpose of the experiment is to observe natural behavior, how a species acts when left to its own decisions, then any direct interference would corrupt the data. It would change the outcome, making it impossible to measure what humans would do on their own. In that case, even when the risk of self-destruction becomes high, the observers would remain silent, because stepping in would defeat the purpose. The second possibility is that intervention has occurred, but not in ways we can clearly recognize. Subtle influences, small nudges, moments of hesitation in critical decisions. Individuals who chose restraint when escalation was possible. History contains several moments when catastrophe seemed imminent and yet did not happen. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, multiple military commanders on both sides had the authority to escalate the conflict. Some argued for immediate action, some prepared for the worst. But the final decisions, the ones that prevented a nuclear exchange, came down to human judgment. Leaders who stepped back from the edge.
Were those decisions purely human? Most historians would say yes. But if someone were observing, measuring whether humanity could choose restraint over destruction, those moments would be the most important data points of all. Moments where the system nearly failed, but corrected itself. Then there is a third possibility, that the observers did intervene at some point, and then stopped. That early in human history there may have been influence, guidance, knowledge, subtle adjustments, but once humanity reached a certain stage of development, the observers withdrew completely. A final phase of the experiment. No assistance, no correction, only observation. If that is the case, then the silence we experience today is not neglect, it is design. A condition where the subjects must determine their own outcome without external help. And not would explain why, despite centuries of technological advancement, we have not found clear, undeniable evidence of intervention. No global message, no universally accepted contact, only fragments, stories, data points that remain ambiguous and debated. It is as if any presence that might exist has chosen to remain just beyond certainty, visible enough to be questioned, hidden enough to be denied. Because certainty would change everything. If humanity knew beyond doubt that it was being observed or evaluated, our behavior would shift. Our decisions would no longer be purely our own. They would be influenced by the knowledge of being watched. And that would alter the outcome of the experiment. So the observers, if they exist, would need to remain in the shadows, close enough to monitor, distant enough to avoid detection, which creates a strange paradox. If we are being observed, we are not supposed to know. And if we are not supposed to know, then any evidence we find will always be incomplete, debatable, and uncertain. Just enough to raise the question, never enough to answer it. But even without external observers, the absence of intervention reveals something important about humanity itself. Because over the past century, despite all the risks and tensions, despite wars, crises, and near misses, humanity has not destroyed itself. Not yet. We have come close, closer than most people realize, but each time something has prevented the final step. Sometimes it was leadership, sometimes it was chance, sometimes it was systems designed to prevent accidental escalation, but ultimately it was human choice. And that suggests that within the code we carry, within all the contradictions and competing impulses, there is also a capacity for restraint, for self-correction.
For stepping back from the edge. It is not perfect, it is not guaranteed, but it exists, which raises another possibility about the purpose of the experiment. Perhaps it was never about creating a perfect species. Perhaps it was about creating a species capable of recognizing its own flaws and choosing to overcome them. A species that could become aware of its own destructive tendencies and actively resist them. Because that is something evolution alone does not guarantee. Self-awareness is rare. Moral reflection is even rarer. The ability to change behavior based on ethical reasoning rather than pure survival instinct is something uniquely human, and that ability has appeared again and again throughout history. Movements for peace, for human rights, for cooperation across cultures and nations. Every time humanity has moved away from conflict and toward collaboration, it has demonstrated something critical. The capacity to evolve, not just biologically, but ethically, to rewrite our own behavior, to adjust the code of our actions, even if we cannot change the code of our DNA. If observers were watching for that, if they were measuring whether humanity could grow beyond its own destructive impulses, then the absence of intervention makes sense. Because the question is not whether we can be saved, it is whether we can save ourselves. And that question cannot be answered for us. It has to be answered by us. Through every decision we make, every system we build, every conflict we resolve or escalate, every moment when we choose cooperation over division. The experiment, in that sense, becomes not a test of intelligence or strength, but a test of wisdom. And wisdom cannot be forced, it has to be chosen. But there is a final, quieter possibility that lingers beneath all of this, a possibility that is more unsettling than the others. What if the observers are no longer there? What if, at some point in the past, the experiment ended and the observers left? What if the silence we experience is not the silence of watching, but the silence of absence? In that scenario, humanity is no longer being evaluated. We are simply alone, a species that may have been influenced in the past, but now exists without guidance, without oversight, without any external reference, left to determine our own future in a universe that does not intervene. That possibility is difficult to accept because it removes the idea that someone might step in if things go too far. It places the full responsibility for our survival and our potential destruction entirely in our own hands. No safety net, no external correction, only our own choices. And yet, in a strange way, that possibility might be the most empowering of all, because it means that whatever the outcome of this story becomes, it will be written by us. Not by observers, not by designers, but by the billions of decisions made by humans across the planet. Which leads to a final thought that echoes quietly through this entire narrative. Whether or not we were ever an experiment, whether or not anyone is still watching, the conditions we face today are real. We have power. We have knowledge. We have the ability to shape the future of our species and our planet. And the absence of intervention, real or perceived, means that the responsibility for what happens next belongs to us. But to understand what that responsibility truly means, we have to look forward, because the next phase of human history is already beginning. New technologies, new capabilities, new risks, new opportunities. And in those developments, the final outcome of this long story may finally take shape. Because the question is no longer just what we were or how we got here. The question is what we will choose to become, now that no one is stepping in to decide for us.
Even in silence, systems leave traces. A laboratory that has been shut down does not instantly become empty. There are instruments left on tables, readings still stored in memory, fragments of data recorded during earlier phases of the experiment. The activity may have stopped, but the signals remain, faint, incomplete, sometimes corrupted, but still present. If humanity was ever part of something larger, then we should expect to find those traces somewhere in our world, and perhaps we have. Across decades of scientific observation, there are signals that do not fully resolve, anomalies that resist easy explanation, patterns that appear once and never repeat in exactly the same way again. They are not proof of anything beyond doubt, but they linger in the margins of our knowledge, like echoes from a process we only partly understand. In 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio detected a narrow-band signal so precise and so unusual that the astronomer who saw it circled the printout and wrote a single word beside it: "Wow." The signal came from deep space, lasted for 72 seconds, and matched many of the criteria scientists use to identify artificial transmissions. It was never detected again. The source has never been confirmed. The data remains an open question. Moments like this appear throughout the history of astronomy, brief, unexplained signals that suggest structure, pattern, or intent, but vanish before they can be studied in detail. Most turn out to be natural phenomena once we learn more. Some remain unexplained. But the most intriguing signals may not come from space. They may come from us. Because if humanity carries within it the remnants of an earlier intervention, if our biology or our cognition contains traces of a design process, then those traces might still be visible in the way we think, create, and communicate. Consider mathematics. Across all cultures, across all eras, humans have independently discovered the same underlying mathematical truths, the same constants, the same patterns, the same relationships between numbers and space. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is the same in every civilization. The patterns of prime numbers appear regardless of language or culture. Mathematics feels discovered rather than invented, as if we are uncovering a structure that already exists. Some scientists and philosophers have suggested that mathematics might be a kind of universal language, a framework that any intelligent species would eventually discover because it reflects the fundamental structure of reality. If that is true, then mathematics could serve as a bridge between intelligences, a shared code. And if someone had once influenced humanity, if there had been a phase where knowledge was introduced or accelerated, then mathematics would be the most efficient way to embed that knowledge, not as direct instructions, but as patterns, clues, structures that would be rediscovered again and again as human understanding grows. And perhaps that is why certain mathematical insights seem to appear in multiple places at similar times, even when cultures were not directly connected, a kind of convergent discovery, or something else. Then there is language. Human language is not just a tool for communication, it is a system for encoding thought, for compressing complex ideas into symbols and sounds that can be transmitted across time. And within language, there are recurring structures, grammatical patterns, narrative forms, archetypal stories that appear across cultures, stories of creation, stories of watchers, stories of beings who shaped humanity and then withdrew. These myths are often interpreted as symbolic, metaphorical, or psychological expressions of human imagination, but they are also consistent. Across continents that had no contact for thousands of years, similar narratives appear. It could be coincidence, it could be a reflection of shared human psychology, or it could be something else. A memory, distorted over time, translated into the language of myth, but rooted in an event or influence that was once more direct. If there had been an earlier phase of the experiment where observers interacted more openly with humanity, then those interactions might survive not as clear historical records, but as stories.
Stories that were retold, reshaped, and eventually understood as mythology. The problem is that mythology is not evidence. It is narrative, open to interpretation, and that makes it impossible to separate memory from imagination with certainty. But the idea of leftover signals does not rely on mythology alone. It also appears in our technology. Modern communication systems, radio, television, the internet, are built on the transmission of signals across space, encoded information, sent from one point to another, decoded by a receiver. As humanity has developed these systems, we have begun searching for signals beyond our planet, listening for patterns that might indicate another intelligence. Projects like SETI have scanned the sky for decades, analyzing radio frequencies, looking for non-random structures. So far, no confirmed artificial signal has been detected, but the search continues. Because the logic is simple. If we can build systems to send and receive signals across space, so could another intelligence. And if such an intelligence had ever interacted with humanity or observed us, it might have left behind traces in the electromagnetic spectrum, signals that were sent, received, or recorded at some point in our past. The challenge is that signals decay. They weaken over distance and time. They are distorted by noise. And without knowing exactly what to look for, it is difficult to distinguish a meaningful pattern from random data. But the possibility remains that somewhere in the background noise of the universe, or even within the data we have already collected, there are fragments of communication we have not yet recognized, leftover signals from an earlier phase of contact or observation, signals that are waiting for us to reach a level of understanding where we can finally interpret them. And then there is the most subtle signal of all, human curiosity. The persistent drive to ask questions about our origin, our purpose, and our place in the universe.
Every culture, every era has produced individuals who look up at the sky and ask the same questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? That curiosity is not necessary for basic survival. A species can survive without questioning its own existence. But humans do more than survive. We search, we investigate, we build instruments to see further, to hear further, to understand more. It is as if the system itself is designed to examine its own origin, a feedback loop where the subject of the experiment becomes the investigator of the experiment. And that raises one final unsettling possibility. What if the leftover signals are not external at all? What if they are internal, encoded not in radio waves or distant transmissions, but in the structure of our minds, the patterns of thought that drive us to explore, to analyze, to seek meaning, the sense that there is something more to reality than what we can immediately observe, the feeling that we are part of a larger story. If those impulses were part of the original design, if they were included to ensure that the subjects would eventually investigate their own condition, then humanity is not just part of the experiment, we are the mechanism through which the experiment reveals itself. But there is a limit to how far internal signals can take us. At some point, the search for answers requires action. Observation becomes exploration. Curiosity becomes expansion. Because if there are signals, leftover or ongoing, they are not all within our reach from the surface of this planet. Some may exist beyond it, in space, in the wider environment that humanity is only just beginning to explore. Which means that the final phase of this story, the point where we might finally understand whether we were ever an experiment, whether anyone is watching, whether the signals we detect are real or imagined, will not be found by looking backward. It will be found by looking outward, by leaving the laboratory, by becoming ourselves the observers. Because when humanity steps beyond Earth, when we carry our questions, our technology, and our curiosity into the wider universe, we are no longer just subjects of a possible experiment. We become participants in a larger one. And in that moment, the roles may begin to change. The watchers may become visible, or we may discover that we were never watched at all. But either way, the next signal we receive may not be a leftover. It may be the first reply.
At first, it felt like relief. After the chaos, the signals, the silence, the unanswered calls into the void, there was a strange calm that settled over everything. Not the kind of calm that follows a storm where debris still litters the ground and the sky slowly clears. No, this calm felt placed, engineered, like the world had been gently reset into a version of itself that was just a little too perfect. No more signals from the sky, no more fluctuations in human behavior, no more anomalies in our cells. Everything had stopped changing. And that was the first sign that something was wrong. The scientists who had tracked the experiment from the beginning were the first to notice it. Every biological process stabilized, mutation rates frozen, cellular decay slowed to an almost unnatural consistency. Even random errors, the tiny imperfections that make life dynamic, had nearly disappeared. Humanity had not been destroyed. It had been stabilized, perfected, locked into a version of itself that would no longer evolve. At first, the world celebrated. Diseases stopped progressing. Genetic disorders halted in place. Aging slowed in subtle but measurable ways. Accidents still happened, but the body's ability to recover seemed optimized. It looked like a miracle. But a few people, the ones who had seen the sky change, who had watched the code rewrite itself, who had followed the signals even when no one else believed, felt something else entirely. A quiet, growing fear. Because evolution had not just slowed, it had been paused. And evolution is not just how we change, it is how we adapt. Weeks passed, then months,
and something subtle began to happen. The world stopped surprising us. No new artistic movements emerged, no sudden leaps in technology, no sudden bursts of creativity that changed everything overnight. Music still played, stories were still written, people still dreamed, but the dreams began to feel familiar, as if every possible variation of imagination had already been explored, and now the mind simply recycled what already existed. Humanity had reached a strange, invisible ceiling. The leftover signals, those faint echoes that still whispered from space, continued to flicker in the background of sensitive instruments. Not commands, not corrections, just observations, like a system watching its completed work, waiting, measuring, recording. One day, a final pattern was detected in the noise. Not a message, a question, encoded in the same biological language that had rewritten our cells, hidden inside the leftover signals, repeating over and over at a frequency just low enough that only the most sensitive systems could detect it. When decoded, it didn't give instructions, it didn't give warnings, it simply asked, did they understand? The question spread quietly through the scientific community. No one published it publicly, no one announced it on the news, but among those who knew, a debate began that would never fully be resolved. What was the experiment? Was it meant to improve us, to stabilize us before we destroyed ourselves, to preserve us as a species? Or was it never about helping us at all? What if it was about learning from us?
Think about it. A species that evolves unpredictably, that creates art, war, compassion, and destruction in equal measure. A species whose greatest strength is its ability to change in ways no system can fully predict. And then, suddenly, that unpredictability is removed. The chaos is gone. The variables are controlled. Humanity becomes understandable, measurable, stable, safe. Maybe the experiment was never about improving humanity. Maybe it was about turning humanity into something that could finally be understood. But that raises a deeper, more unsettling question. If we are now stable, predictable, no longer evolving, then are we still human in the way we once were? Or are we a finished version of ourselves, a final draft that will never be edited again? And then there's the most dangerous question of all, the one no one wants to say out loud. If the experiment is complete, if the observers have gathered all the data they needed, if we are now fully stabilized and understood, then what happens when the observers decide they are done watching? No new signals have come. No new changes have occurred. The sky remains quiet. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and the air feels just slightly too perfect, some people swear they can feel it. A presence, not interfering, not guiding, just waiting. As if somewhere, beyond what we can see, something is still asking that same final question, watching us live our stabilized lives, measuring our thoughts, listening to our silence, waiting to see if we will ever ask the question back. Because maybe the experiment isn't over. Maybe it's only reached its final stage, the stage where nothing changes, where nothing evolves, where nothing surprises, and where the only variable left is whether a species that has been given perfect stability will eventually realize what it has lost. So here's the final question, the one that matters more than any code, any signal, any experiment. If you discovered tomorrow that humanity had been stabilized, perfected, made safe and predictable forever, would you accept it? Or would you fight to bring back the chaos, the uncertainty, the evolution, the very imperfections that made us human?
And if the watchers in the sky are still listening, what do you think they're hoping your answer will be?